I feel the hand of history upon our shoulders.
All this tradition of ours, our school history, our songs, this part of the history of our country, all were gone.
Well, Mary, it's great to be in your garden.
That's nice to see you, Dan, face to face.
Well, last time I saw you fed me lots of red wine in that room over there. This time we're being a bit more healthy and wholesome in your garden.
That's right.
Very
That's
nice.
right. Yes.
We're here to talk about the Caesars. Why you point out in your book that these are probably the most famous people in the world before the era of mass media.
Apart from Jesus.
Quite right.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, that's what I suppose I wanted to find out doing the book, really, because, I mean, you can't go anywhere. You can't go to any museum. You can't look at cartoons in newspapers without seeing Roman emperors. They're on pop signs. There's Nero fiddling while Rome burns, and whether he's Trump or G.W. Bush or Gordon Brown or whatever, they're there everywhere. And you go to a museum and they line up. You go to stately homes and there they all are. And mostly, me included, we walk past them. Right? You kind of don't quite know who they are. If you do know who they are, you think, oh God, another load of Roman emperors. And what I wanted to do was to kind of try to put together the fact that they are everywhere and that people have spent lifetimes recreating them, reimagining them, with our sort of sense of just taking them for granted and not being too bothered by them. And I mean, I suppose the one aim of the book really is that, we don't know if I've succeeded, but the one aim of the book is that when people now go to a museum and they see a lineup of Roman emperors, they'll say, oh, that's interesting. Some Roman emperors. And I hope that what I do is give people a few kind of lines with which to process them and understand them and think they're interesting. So I don't know if I've solved the question of why are they so important. I could have a go at that. But I can show us, I think, why we should take them seriously as being important.
Well, but it's striking, and what you point out is that every generation has taken to that task in a very different way.
Yeah.
And if you go back to the kind of Enlightenment period, the obsession with Rome you see here in the UK, constantly in the conversation with the present, their presence, thinking about empire, thinking about republicanism, thinking about power. What do you think? How have the Roman empires changed? How have the Roman emperors changed over the course of your career? When you started to become a classicist, what were they? What were they doing then?
That's quite a tricky one, because I think they've changed differently in film and popular culture and in kind of academic writing. And actually, I'm not trying to divide those into kind of, the posh and the not posh. I think that, I'm into popular culture as much as I'm into academic writing, but they take different paths, I think. And in most cases, academic writing, no, but in most cases it's been less concerned with individual emperors than it used to be. Still a bit, but what people are interested in universities and in research is about power, about the presentation of power, how the emperor works as a structure, and how the imperial system is an institution. And they're not that much bothered about, peccadillos of Domitian, amusing himself by killing flies.
Combing back over Suetonius.
And finding all those anecdotes, of course, that we really love, of what does Domitian do in his spare time? Skewer flies with his pen nib, this kind of stuff. Now, the Academy has rather kind of taken a dim view of that and sort of wanted to push it on one side. Now, I think in some ways I'm involved with that, and I can speak that talk. But I'm more interested in seeing how these emperors have constantly been reimagined as individuals. Nero has just killed his mother. What does he look like? Is he feeling guilty or isn't he? And I think in that sense, there are changes, but they're very much symbols who were used in the same way, or they're used in the same kinds of debates over and over again. And in some ways, that's what's really exciting for me. You go back to somebody in the 16th century, there's all kinds of things I couldn't talk to them about, but I could discuss whether Vitellius was a good bloke or not.
It's like maths. It's like sort of physics. We could go back and we can talk to alien species about number patterns and things. We could talk to people from the 16th century about which emperors we liked.
Yes. And I think that, so there is a kind of nice connection. There's a nice recognisability, and I think when I pick up little things, from junk shops, 19th century little models of Caligula, say, I kind of think, right, there's a connection here, and some people were thinking, not always the same way as me, but we were investing this little model with the same sorts of questions. Was he good? Was he bad? Why was he like? What did he look like? How do we know what these guys look like? Well, we think we do. We may partly be right, but not entirely.
How many emperors do you deal with in this book?
I basically deal with 12.
It's the first, yeah.
I do. That's because, I don't, keep every single other one out of the picture if they're useful. But look, the key text for the Renaissance and for us in thinking about emperors in many ways is Suetonius' Lives of the Caesars, and he starts from Julius Caesar, who wasn't really an emperor, but he kind of faces both ways. He's a kind of old republican and a new imperial figure, and it goes on through the First Dynasty, Civil War, 3 very short-lived emperors, followed by the new Flavian dynasty up to Domitian, who is then assassinated. So we go from, well, let's say the 40s BC to 96 AD. And they've always been the kind of centre of what people have thought about. They're not the only famous ones. People
have heard of Hadrian.
They've heard of Hadrian because of the wall across Britain. They've heard of Marcus Aurelius because he was the philosopher who wrote his rather, I think, cliched thoughts about things. But the first 12 emperors have been very much the nucleus. And when artists came along and wanted to do sets, because emperors always come in sets, we're interested in individuals, but we're also interested dynastically. In order to do a set, what do? They'll make you a set. What would you like, sir? Well, it's going to be set from Julius Caesar to Domitian. And so I concentrated on those. I think there's an intellectual and academic reason for concentrating on those. I also think, actually, they're quite enough to be dealing with. So they're my nucleus, and we look outside occasionally.
Where is the new scholarship coming from? So to go back to looking at them kind of biographically, or even politically, and how the office changes under them. Have we discovered new sources, written sources, or are we analysing ones we've already got? Or the sections you're working on, thing archaeology and stuff. I mean, are there other new areas that are bringing light onto these emperors?
Yeah, look, the truth is that most modern ancient history, ancient history is done by people like me. Most of it is looking afresh at stuff we've known for a long time. And I don't feel very apologetic about that, because actually we transform our view of the past by looking at it again. Right? It's we reanalyse how the economy of the Roman Empire worked. For a start, we reanalyse the very nature of what Romans thought of as an empire. Right? So there's plenty to do. I'd be very happy, let's say, being an ancient historian, if nothing new was ever found. I've got plenty to do. Right? It would take you a lifetime to read everything written in the Roman Empire. So there's plenty to work on. So that's fine. But of course it's interestingly enlivened by new discoveries, which, I think come up just often enough so that when maybe one's excitement is flagging, you get something new. In the last 20 years, there's one new portrait which is claimed to be Julius Caesar was discovered in the River Rhone at Arles. Archaeologists were thinking, what's on the bed of the River Rhone? This guy comes up, and someone shouts out, I'm going to make this a bit more polite than it is in the original, my God, that's Julius Caesar. So you have those my God, that's Julius Caesar moments. But there are all sorts of surprising discoveries about these emperors, often coming up in things like inscribed texts. The Romans were mad inscribers of documents, and they didn't just write them down on a piece of paper, they scrawled it onto stone or bronze and put it up. And those kind of documents are coming up, continue to come up. They've been reused as somebody's doorstep, and the builders come along, they turn it over, and they discover underneath there's what they can recognise is Latin, but they don't know what it says. It turns out to be an important document. And there, for example, you find, again, quite recently, there was the absolute, apparently, verbatim account of a trial in the Senate that took place under Tiberius for the murder of his adopted son Germanicus, who supposedly died in terribly painful circumstances while
Was he poisoned? Who knows?
Was he poisoned? Who did it? Who was going to take the rap? And the Senate's discussion of that and their basic forcing into suicide of the guy who was the most convenient guy to take the rap, that's newly discovered. And, you actually it takes you right into a discussion of the Senate. And people, I think ancient historians are sometimes quite bad at selling themselves, because they let this view get abroad that, it's all Julius Caesar kind of conquering Gaul, and but it's not that. We actually, we've got what these guys said. We've got, there's Germanicus, the unfortunate murder victim, fetches up against the rules in Egypt one day, doing a bit of a sightseeing trip to Egypt. The Romans are dead keen on sightseeing in Egypt. And we've got a copy on papyrus of the speech he gave when he got to Alexandria. And there's cheers, and they write in cheers, And Germanicus is going, just please listen. And then he starts off by saying, I've come a very long way. And I have to say, I do miss my granny. And who he means by his granny is the fierce, poisoning old Empress Livia. And you think, gosh, these documents, they give you a different side of things. Even, we're not even talking about ordinary people here. We're talking about the imperial family. There's more to see of them. So it's very exciting. But the baseline is always re-looking at some familiar stuff. You can never read too much of Tacitus.
We've inherited a kind of fascination with their foibles, their peccadillos, Caligula, Nero, etc. Why, when actually the Georgians in Britain were off the pitch? So what is it about that?
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because if you say George III, let's say, you won't get a kind of, even in the UK, you won't get the same flicker of recognition if you say Nero. Yeah. Now, I think partly they are at a safe distance. I'm not sure that it felt like that in the 16th century, and that might be one difference. But for us, we can talk about the wickedness of these guys, whether it's in terms of gossip or whether we really want to kind of analyse the nature of tyrannical power, and it's sufficiently distanced from us that we're safe. We can argue about it. So I think that's a help to us. I think also it's there's something about being famous for being famous. That Nero and how he is described by Suetonius has been kind of written into our version of what royal power is for hundreds of years. you know, and it's provided us with the building bricks of transgression. How do you think about a teenager? Because that's what Nero is. How do we think about a teenager on the throne? What about a teenager who murders his mum? And we see that not just through Roman literary texts, because there's loads of people in the world who, for very good reasons, have never opened a copy of Suetonius or Tacitus. They still recognise Nero, and they do it for all kinds of reasons, because there's Victorian paintings, there's kind of cartoons that you find in newspapers, that they've become, as it were, more than good and bad emperors. They've become symbols of power, but idiosyncratic and vivid and larger than life symbols of power that we can use to talk about ourselves. And also I think monarchs, if you say, so why do these guys why do these monarchs in early modern Europe, why do they shove all these pictures of these emperors up? Because they must know that they're extremely bad example. Most of them end up, not dead peacefully in their bed. Most of them are decried as tyrants. Of the first 12, the only one there is no known allegations that he was murdered is Vespasian. So why do dynastic powers think, let's put a set of these up? Well, partly I think because they're also quite interested. I've gained a certain sympathy for monarchs while I've been doing this book, because I think, there's nowhere lonelier in the world to be than a palace, the middle of a palace. And these guys are trying desperately to think about how they should think about themselves. They know that they're an ordinary human being. And their question is, so how is it that I'm a king? And I think that a lot of that kind of projection and questioning at the very top of the tree, not the likes of me, but the very top of the tree, is projected onto Roman emperors. You go to Hampton Court, that really, really extravagantly Baroque staircase leading up to the king's apartments in Hampton Court, done by Verrio. And you look at what it is, even you can get over how awful it looks, you look at what it is, and it's a whole series of Roman emperors. And yeah, that's odd, and they all look a bit strange. And it's been discussed for a very long time. It was only really in the 30s that an art historian cracked it and saw that it was based on a satiric essay by a late Roman emperor, Emperor Julian, who was writing a satire on his predecessors. And the whole point of this satire was that he wanted to say, let's imagine that the old gods, the proper gods, are going to consider inviting these emperors, the dead emperors, to dinner. And, would they let them in? And the joke of the satire is they go through these emperors one by one, and the proper gods, Jupiter, Juno, and all the rest, they say, God, I'm not having him. Nero, no, no way. Julius, absolute monster. They think maybe they'll have Marcus Aurelius, but they're not sure. And so what you have on the staircase for every monarch to walk past is a picture of these emperors being rejected by the proper gods. Now, either nobody ever thought about it, they also thought, bloody hell, it's a bit Baroque, right? Or they're engaging with this. So I think there is idiosyncrasy, there's larger than lifeness, but there are also some big questions about tyrannical power.
The other thing is they are the first and most powerful set of sort of named heads of state in Western Europe, aren't they?
Yeah,
they are seen as almost a founding dynasty to these successor states that then had successors.
And these guys in medieval and later Europe they did try this sort of mad scheme, which they managed to convince themselves was true, that somehow there was a direct inheritance from Roman dynastic power to the Holy Roman Empire. So there was a legitimacy there, and you can say, look, individually these guys might all have come to a sticky end, but it was a dynastic system that continued for hundreds of years. So, either you can say the Romans got it terribly wrong, who wants to be like Caligula, or you can say there was a system here that transcended those individual idiosyncrasies, and somehow the system survives.
I've asked this before. That is the thing I find so fascinating, particularly because when you're raised, as I was, on a diet of those idiosyncrasies. We talk about their sexual and their sort of the behavioural shortcomings, or however you want to describe it. And yet, the empire, first, second centuries, it's somewhere along in the engine room somewhere, someone is doing something right.
Yes, and that is, of course, a very tricky point, which exercises the sort of more scholarly versions of Roman history, because one solution would be to say, look, however much these accounts we have of these emperors are wildly exaggerated, let's say they are, what is clear is that the empire trogs along. Nothing much happens. Caligula's on the throne, apparently a complete, basket case, psychopath.
The loss of Germany, catastrophe, it's actually got nothing to do with Augustus's personal life at all, right?
These emperors are written up, cruelly, actually. I mean, in terms of modern issues about ableism and neurodivergence, these guys are treated as if they are mad in the old-fashioned traditional sense of the word mad. So the obvious explanation, and it might or might not be true, is that somebody else is doing the work. That's you can say, if these guys who if they're anything like we're told, they can't be running the empire. The empire is run. Therefore, someone else must be running it. That's the, and one thing you can do is you can, and it's what I don't do in this book. What I'm looking at the moment is, so who are the staff? Can you find the staff in the imperial palace? Well, you can. You can. I mean, you can find. You can find the Empress Livia's handbag carrier, and you can find a lot of domestic staff. You can find the food tasters for the imperial banquets. And all that. And we learn a little bit about the kind of the civil service, the people who were often ex-slaves, freed slaves, who were presumably in charge of, because if they're in charge of, the secretariat, the accounts department. You can see a bit of that. What you can't, and so you can put together a sort of, you can populate the palace, with the cooks and the napkin holders and the secretaries and the Greek secretaries and the Roman secretaries, all that, you can do that. You can't see where the decisions are made. So, I think it is very interesting to start to kind of put back the people on whom this system obviously depends, but you still don't see where the strategic decision about anything is being made. Do they sit around after dinner, under Augustus, and say, well, do you think we should invade Parthia? And as soon as you start posing that question, you start sounding like a Second World War movie, right? As if you've got there and you've got the salt cellar and if that happened, which it may have done, we have absolutely no evidence for it at all.
But this is just presumably, this is our White House Situation Room and our Cobra meetings. If Rome was an empire of provinces, of super powerful local elites like you described to me before, and that actually has it's quite difficult for us to recognise that, but it would have had a huge robustness.
Well, the robustness is because they're basically operating hands off. In our terms, Romans are very thin on the ground. But apart from the army, British India looks pretty thin on the ground of British administrators. The Romans, it's trivial. There's tiny numbers, so they operate clearly by collaboration with the elite, the existing elites. They have to do that. Somebody once joked, and I can't remember what exact date he was referring to, but when the Romans left Britain, the armies have gone, how many Romans actually left? And he said, probably about 5. So you've got I've got a very thin veneer of actual guys doing any work, apart from the army and force. It's one of the ways of describing it is an empire of force. This is a military state.
Occasionally a big sledgehammer gets.
Occasionally a big sledgehammer, but mostly, you operate through the local elites, going on much as they did before, and what the job of the Romans to do isn't not actually to bother about anybody who's not in the local elite, but to make sure that the local elites are on side, and to, as far as possible, incorporate them into a kind of set of Roman structures. That has to be how it's done. It's an empire of collaboration.
But Mary Beard, you're hurting my brain now, because if we're going to talk about tyranny, and we're going to think about the Roman Empire, Roman emperors, and the effect of wielding absolute power on individuals. What if they don't? If they don't have such power, then why are they tyrants?
I know. You see that? Well, that is exactly the big issue. There's a great novel by Christoph Ransmayr called The Other Worlds, and this novel ends up being a sort of exploration of a real world that's like Ovid's Metamorphoses. Everything's changing shape everywhere. But the beginning of the novel, we eventually meet Augustus. And Augustus is on his own in a room in the palace, and he's looking through the window, as I remember it, looking at his pet crocodile. And you think that there isn't a centre to this. When there's not a centre, then you can still use the figure of the emperor as your explanatory device if you're a Roman historian. And it still then comes down to the morality of the emperor. You can still say, cruel, hypocritical, or generous, one of us, etc. So it's a huge kind of Chinese box effect of people, using the emperor to explain things that they don't otherwise understand. And if you kind of go through this and you take all the boxes out and you come to the middle, there's this awful sense that there might be nothing there. So this kind of tyranny, which is so vividly summed up by Roman writers and modern writers on this, might all be smoke and mirrors.
Thank you very much, Mary Beard.
I feel the hand of history upon our shoulders.
All this tradition of ours, our school history, our songs, this part of the history of our country, all were gone and finished.